Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever time you may be listening to the show. Welcome to the Carving It Up U.S. Presidents Edition. We are now on episode 4. We're going to be covering 5 presidents today: Andrew Johnson, Ulysses S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, James A. Garfield, and finally Chester A. Arthur. So I'm going to be joined by my co-host Isaac Lawson in just a second. He's been with me throughout the series, and he will be with me and with y'all throughout the rest of this series. So we left off in episode 3 on kind of a somber note. We left off in April of 1865 when 2 very, very major events happened. On April 9th, the Civil War basically unofficially ended because General Robert E. Lee of the Confederates surrendered his army to the Union, and General Ulysses S. Grant, who, as you've of course just heard, is going to be president in short order. But you got that, but then 5 days later, tragically, the man who led the country through the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, is assassinated at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. And so now we come to a time where, okay, the Civil War's over. That battle, quote unquote, has passed. But now we're about to enter a new battle, and that is Reconstruction. So to join the show right now, Isaac Lawson. He's been with me throughout the series. Let's see. All right, Isaac, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. It's great to have you back on. So before we get into to Andrew Johnson, kind of, I guess give it's kind of a 2-part question, but give the people an idea of where we are in history, like kind of the significance of it, and what to expect throughout these 5 administrations.
So we're entering into kind of the Reconstruction era, and that goes into the literal Reconstruction of the South, but also kind of a political Reconstruction that we're going to see taking place even after that Reconstruction of the South has ended. And we'll see that carry through through all of the presidencies in this episode. I think that's a good word for this era. I think something for the viewers to kind of look out for is definitely that these are some very frustrating administrations. You see a lot of them kind of recognizing issues, and I think in a lot of areas working to try to fix those issues, but they tend to be pretty ineffective. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, and obviously we'll get into that in just a little bit.
No, I think you hit it right on the money. I mean, it's very. I'd say many of you will hear of presidents, those maybe who aren't as familiar with American history. You'll hear some presidents maybe you've never heard of before, but make no mistake about it, they were extremely significant in history. So, like I mentioned earlier, we're in 1865, and there's a big conspiracy out to pretty much take out all the major leaders in government, at least for the Union. So Lincoln is assassinated. The Secretary of State, Seward, is stabbed. Thankfully, he survives. And General Grant was also targeted. He was supposed to go with Lincoln to Ford's Theater, but he was out of town visiting his family in New Jersey, I believe. And so Andrew Johnson is also the one of the targets, the new vice president. He's only been in office for a month. And so he's the target of this conspiracy led by John Wilkes Booth. And so he was offered tickets to go to the play, but did not go. I think that was obviously hindsight, a pretty good idea. But he's at, I believe, is the Kirkwood home in Washington, D.C. And one of Booth's co-conspirators knows the room where he's at. And Johnson apparently that night, read, put out a candle, and went to bed. And had the plan gone accordingly, the co-conspirator would have gone to Johnson's door, knocked on it, and Johnson would have answered it. And at that point, a knife would have been plunged into his heart. Thankfully, this did not happen. The guy lost his nerve and got drunk and pretty much, that's what happened. So Andrew Johnson became the first president to assume office via assassination. So let's go and get into it. The presidency of Andrew Johnson. Number 17, Andrew Johnson, Democrat Union, 1865 to 1869, 56 years old, from Tennessee. So Andrew Johnson, we're to a point now where it's pretty rocky because you've obviously got the assassination of Lincoln. We're now transitioning to Reconstruction. Before we get into his presidency, he was born on December the 29th of 1808 to Mary McDonough and Jacob Johnson, and he married Eliza McArdle in 1827, and they had 5 children together. And in many, many ways, Isaac, as is the case with most vice presidents and presidents, Johnson was really Lincoln's opposite.
Mhm. So there's a lot of interesting things about Andrew Johnson, about his choice as vice president, and also just about his like upbringing and background and the way that relates to his presidency, or even maybe more interesting, how it didn't relate to his presidency. So for like his choice to be Lincoln's VP, there's a lot of interesting things there. He was the only Democrat that was elected from the South that refused to secede with Congress. So obviously that's kind of like a big kind of patriotic push. Like he's staying with the Union. He also served as military governor of Tennessee and was appointed by Lincoln to that position. Tennessee was the first state retaken by the Union during the war. And then he is nominated on, actually, it's a National Union Party ticket with Lincoln when Lincoln ran for reelection, which was mostly Republicans, but the idea was to kind of create this bipartisan party that's purpose was solely preserving the Union. And most Republicans got behind it. They did not nominate a candidate that election cycle. Um, so Johnson is stuck on there as kind of this pro-union Democrat that's being used to promote what is essentially Republican values, and he knows that. But the best way to describe him personality-wise is like stubborn and kind of a jerk. And like he knew that. He knew both of those things and sometimes leaned into them. Um, so like he had no problem being like, okay, I hate all the Democrats over here. Like they're betraying the union. They suck. He had no problem doing that. That was no issue for him. But he wasn't doing it because he was like power hungry either. He didn't really care about that as much as we can tell. So I think that's all interesting as like a political choice for Lincoln. Um, Now, just for his background, something that I think is interesting. So he was actually an indentured servant as a child. His parents were very, very poor. He became an indentured servant to a tailor, and we don't have a lot of accounts, but from the accounts we do have, it appears that he was probably not treated very well. He ran away when he was little, and that's actually how he wound up going from North Carolina to Tennessee. And he is well known for having been a tailor. That's generally a fact people know about him if you bring him up. But the interesting thing about that is that there are a lot of quotes from him talking about the evils of indentured servitude. And it's interesting to see, I think, how that does and also at times doesn't play into his views on slavery, which I think is very interesting because he's someone who this is personal for, like he understands it, but he also doesn't seem to care as much as he should for someone who
See, did I think we may have just lost Isaac. You still with me? Okay, hold on. I think we just lost Isaac. Let's see. I'll bring him back.
Sorry,
Okay.
can you hear
Oh,
me now?
can you hear me? Oh, okay. Yeah,
Yes,
there we
that
go.
was very
Go ahead.
odd. My internet just like cut out for a second. Let's hope that
No, don't
doesn't
worry
happen
about it.
again.
Hey, it happens. Technology.
Yes.
But you were saying?
Um, but it's very interesting because like in his personal writings, he was very much like indentured servitude is evil, like this should not be a thing. And he even like compares it to slavery and makes the comparison at times. And sometimes in his political career, he makes that point, like slavery is evil. But then like he was a slave owner and he also was pretty racist. And it's interesting to see how like it was like a weird pick and choose with that, which is just confusing. Um, anyway, as we transition into like the actual start of his presidency, I'd like to give a little bit of background there too. So you think we're not only coming out of the Civil War and the first assassination of a president ever, you also have uh, almost all Republican cabinet with a now Democrat president being sworn in
Yeah.
that none of them really know, whose reputation is for being like a stubborn jerk. And at his inauguration as vice president and Lincoln's second inauguration, he was actually drunk.
Yeah, he was.
And we believe there's no record of him having like an alcohol problem. We think that he may have been like prescribed alcohol for like some sort of illness, possibly, but we don't know for sure. But we know he was drunk and he gave a very embarrassing speech at Lincoln's second inauguration. So you have all those things coming together. So as things play out, and you'll see where kind of the views of the cabinet and the views of members of Congress really affect his presidency. That background of this is someone that we don't really like. He's from a political party that we view as traitorous. We never thought he was going to become president, and the first time we met him, really, what he was drunk at like this very important event. So he doesn't have a great start to the vice presidency or to the presidency.
Not in the slightest, and you made a good point that I was going to bring up about him being drunk at his inauguration as vice president. So, yeah, I mean, as the old saying goes, and it's true, you don't get a second chance at a first impression. And
Mhm,
like you said, that this reputation kind of carries all the way throughout his presidency. But you brought up pretty much all the major points, right? He's stubborn, like you say, he's kind of a jerk. Doesn't seem to bother him. But unlike Lincoln, of course, he was a Democrat. Lincoln was a Republican. You have the fact that Johnson, unlike Lincoln, was extremely thin-skinned, hated criticism, whereas
mhm,
Lincoln would kind of use like self-deprecating humor. Lincoln didn't care. Like Lincoln had bigger things to worry about. Johnson didn't seem to have that sort of that same mindset. And you brought up another point about, he was a slave owner, and an argument can be made Johnson might be the most racist president we've had. He refers to black people as savages and barbarians. So, and he basically says that they should just go back to the plantation, basically bring slavery back, which, wasn't this the point of the Civil War? At least eventually the point of the Civil War. One of them is to free slaves.
mhm,
So he basically refrained from any strong policy making on Reconstruction until Congress left, not to return until December of that year. We're still in 1865. So he kind of stays in the background a little bit. But once Congress leaves, this kind of opens up for him to do whatever he wants. Basically in the defeated South, they're thinking, oh, we're kind of screwed. This is going to be the worst. They're going to punish us. Heck, they may, maybe they'll hold us as POWs. I mean, it's not going to be
mhm.
good. But Johnson was quite on the opposite end of what they thought they were getting, because look, hey, Johnson was a Southerner after all. And so basically he makes it very easy for them to all come back in the Union. And basically he gave nothing, almost nothing at least, to the freed slaves, and they still were not given citizenship or the right to vote. So most, if not all, the states come back fairly easily into the Union. And so Congress returns in December, and they're kind of surprised to see all this.
Mm,
And what they start doing, and this kind of becomes the theme of the Johnson presidency, the Andrew Johnson presidency, is Congress passed multiple pieces of legislation for Reconstruction, and Johnson vetoed almost all of them. As a matter of fact, he vetoed 29 bills, which had more than doubled the previous record of his hero Andrew Jackson, who vetoed 12 bills as president. You got to remember, Jackson served 8 years, Johnson not even a full 4. So talk about that sort of tumultuous 4-year relationship between Andrew Johnson Congress, and how, I mean, again, Johnson vetoes almost anything, and basically nothing gets done.
So one thing that I would like to say is that Johnson was a man of principle. So he wasn't like, while he could do things just to be a jerk sometimes, most of the time he was doing things because he believed in it. Now, for the Reconstruction stuff, that sounds makes it sound so much worse. And part of it was because of some of his racist views. But as president, he had kind of two main views on it. One was that he just viewed it not as being the federal government's responsibility. He was like, who votes is up to the states. Um, and that was something that he like had kind of said before the war and after the war, and he did view it as important to kind of uphold Lincoln's legacy, but that also wasn't his primary concern. So you see this weird mix of wanting to uphold Lincoln's legacy, his own racist views, and this kind of strong principle that he's always held, and it creates this kind of deadly combo for him in Congress, because you have a radical Republican Congress. These are Republicans who basically are saying, like, we want full civil rights. We want this to be extremely hard for Southern states to rejoin the Union. We want probably a really long and drawn out Reconstruction. And Johnson is basically like, no, I'm not going to do that. That sounds dumb to me. I don't want to do it. And he was someone who I think there are some Andrew Jackson comparisons that can be made. I don't think Johnson was as crazy as Andrew Jackson was.
No.
Um, but I think in the sense that like if somebody was doing something that Andrew Jackson didn't like, he'd kind of be like, no, like I'm just not going to do it. Um, Johnson did the same thing where he would just be like, no, like I'm okay, you're telling me to do this, Congress. I don't care. Um, but that didn't really work out well for him because even though he would veto things, Congress can override vetoes, and they're the ones that are ultimately passing the laws. So basically, Congress just stripped the executive branch of a lot of authority during his presidency and started kind of running the country by themselves in a way that we really haven't seen in over 100 years, like talking about from modern day, of the legislative branch probably being the biggest and strongest in of the three. So they were doing most of the work, and the executive was kind of being whittled down. But Johnson was still kind of like adamant about his vision of Reconstruction and the way that he thought things should be done. And like historians have kind of debated about like there are positive and negatives to some of this, like letting the South come back in an easier way may have been a good thing for like unity for the country, but at the same time, not emphasizing the rights of the freed Black Americans was not a good thing. Like, those rights needed to be emphasized and they needed to be protected.
Right.
And they needed to be protected federally because the state governments weren't going to do it. And this wasn't like some minor issue, this was the issue. And he kind of failed to see that, I think. And that I think is partially because of stubbornness. And I think part of it is because I'm not sure he wanted to see it. And that's what makes his kind of like arguments with Congress kind of hard because they're debating with these two like completely polar opposite ideological viewpoints, where to him, his viewpoint is obvious. And they're sitting there arguing with him, and just no matter what they say to him, he is not going to change his mind. And that's just kind of who Andrew Johnson was. And I actually find him in some ways kind of endearing. Like his stubbornness, I find a little bit endearing just as a character trait. Like there's so many entertaining interactions with him with people because he just was not going to change his mind, and it's funny. But it's also like when you look at it the weight of the things that he was dealing with, it's like this is terrible. Like this is awful. This is not who you want the president to be. Having a president that is so set in like their own beliefs that they're not willing to like have any sort of compromise is terrible. Um, but it is entertaining, and that's kind of the way that I would describe his kind of presidency and his relations with Congress, especially.
Yeah, and to go back to your point about how some historians have debated whether, hey, maybe bringing the South in the Union might have actually been a pretty good idea. I was
Mhm,
thinking about that in regards to Lincoln, because remember when Lincoln in his I believe his second inaugural address, he mentioned malice toward none and charity for all.
mhm,
Maybe if Lincoln had lived, maybe he brings the South back into the Union. Obviously, he would have, I would think, had given black people the right to vote and citizenship and all of that,
mhm,
unlike Johnson. But maybe as far as just specifically bringing the Southern states back in, maybe that doesn't change that much if Lincoln's
mhm,
president. So that's something I thought about, and that's certainly a possibility. But again, like you said, he's very stubborn. It's a tumultuous relationship. He and Congress back and forth, and you mentioned about Congress at one point did become. I guess you could say the most powerful of the three branches. And as a matter of fact, they proceeded to overturn 15 of Johnson's vetoes once they did have the votes to do so. And so if we come to a very pivotal point, really, I would say the defining moment of the Johnson presidency, 1867, Congress passes the Tenure of Office Act, which took the president's authority away to remove appointees without the Senate's consent. And this was obviously clearly directed at Johnson,
mhm,
and his entire cabinet was Lincoln's cabinet. And so Congress's plan, if this was their intention, and I'm 99% sure it was, it worked perfectly for them
mhm,
because Johnson fired the Secretary of War, a man named Edwin Stanton, as the two often clashed. They went back and forth. And because of this, Congress made Andrew Johnson the very first president in American history to be impeached because he had violated the Tenure of Office Act. Basically, that they could, it was their way to try and get rid of him because they knew he'd
mhm,
fall into the trap. He would fire somebody, and this would give them a reason to pretty much kick him out of office. And so, really, the impeachment trial from here is just a mess. So, talk about just what all went on and sort of. I mean, this is clear. This is a partisan war between Johnson and the Republicans. So, just talk about that a little bit.
So, like you said, Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War, he and Johnson did not get along at all. They did have this kind of mutual respect for each other. Like they didn't like hate each other as people. They just did not agree on anything, which for like a president and his cabinet does not work very well. Um, but Edwin Stanton was a radical Republican and was very popular among members of Congress, and they did not want to see him go. And Stanton himself was concerned about who Johnson would appoint to replace him as Secretary of War. And this played into kind of like possibly ending Reconstruction, that sort of thing. So basically, Johnson kind of is like playing with the members of Congress and is like, oh, like, I don't know how long he's going to be here, guys. Like, we'll see. Maybe I'll fire him. So Congress passes the Tenure in Office Act, which like is kind of universally agreed upon unconstitutional. And they knew that it was, but they basically, like you said, were setting a trap for him because they knew that as soon as they did that, that he would 100% take the bait and fire him. And he did. And like Johnson wasn't dumb. Like he knew that it was a trap, but he was stubborn and he liked to make people mad. So he was basically like, okay, like I'm gonna fire him now. Like this is unconstitutional and I don't really care and I'm gonna do what I want to do. So he fires him and does not get Senate approval for that. And basically they immediately start impeachment proceedings against him. And this isn't their first attempt to hold impeachment proceedings. This is just the first time they were able to find like a good reason to do it. So basically, it passes through the House, it gets to the Senate, and he's only one vote short of being removed from office.
Yep.
And you think, like, he didn't have a vice president because we didn't have a process to appoint a new one if there was a vacancy, and he hadn't been elected president. So we would have had at the time the president of the Senate would have become the president of the United States. So we could have had what probably would have resulted in another constitutional crisis, similar to like when John Tyler became president. But it was very, I think like his impeachment trial now, everyone like kind of universally agrees was just like a partisan show. Like this was just because they didn't like him, they didn't want a Democrat to be president, they didn't get along. Um, and I don't think anyone at the time, like, really denied it, like, they weren't gonna come out right and say it, but they weren't, like, not saying it either, like, they knew what it was. Um, and it's the first time that, like, the impeachment process is used, and it's basically used because they just can't get along, like, they just don't like each other, they have, these completely polar opposite viewpoints, and they can't come to an agreement on anything, and neither side is really willing to make a compromise on anything. So you just kind of wind up in this like deadly political situation where nothing can get done, and Congress just got tired of the gridlock and decided to try to get rid of him. And obviously that didn't succeed, but it was the closest impeachment we have ever had in this nation's history.
Absolutely, and that's how it all went down. Is the vote. It was what I think it's what 67% would have was required in order to remove
Mhm.
the president, and again by the skin of his teeth, 35-19. He survived, and so it was kind of something about the impeachment. You know, common American citizens were almost like an athletic event, almost like a football game or a basketball game. They were scouting out these tickets because they wanted to see what's going to happen, what's going to go on here. And you're 100% right. It was a partisan mess. It was a partisan battle between the Democrat Johnson and the radical Republicans. Many of course who supported Lincoln, and so you had this where Johnson barely survives impeachment. I'm sorry, he barely survives removal from office. First president to be impeached, certainly for over 100 years, and so he pretty much passes through the rest of his term fairly quietly. After that all happened, he passed by his term quietly. He, not surprisingly, did not win renomination in 1868, so he never got a chance to win his own term in office.
Mhm.
And so he went back home to Greenville, Tennessee, to a warm welcome. And years later, he became the only former president to win a seat in the U.S. Senate. And so it was short-lived because only 4 months into his term, he died on July the 31st of 1865. He was 66 years old. And ironically, Isaac, his kind of hero, and a man he ironically shared a very similar name to, Andrew Jackson. Johnson's last words are eerily similar to that of Jackson.
Mhm.
He said, quote, "Oh, do not cry, be good children, and we shall meet in heaven." And on the other hand, you had Andrew Jackson's final words, which were, if I can pull it up right here, "What is the matter, my dear children? Have I alarmed you? Oh, do not cry. Be good children, and we will all meet in heaven."
Mhm.
I mean, it's kind of, I've always thought it was kind of weird how, in many ways, like you mentioned, I think Jackson was more crazy than Johnson. Certainly, we would have classified him as that today. But these two men, in many ways, were very, very similar. And an argument can be made that Johnson was really the last Jacksonian president,
Mhm.
to occupy the White House. So, I guess before we move on to his successor, talk about sort of his legacy, how it's not looked, not surprisingly, it's not exactly looked fondly upon.
Yeah, I think like there's a couple different aspects to his presidency. One is just, and this is just for this era, which we're basically going to cover in this episode, which is that we are working with a weakened presidency. Congress has stripped a lot of the power from it because they don't trust the presidency after this. Because you think, Lincoln had made it so much larger than it was before, and then it got into the hands of someone that they didn't like, and they were like, this is not going well for us. So they started stripping those powers away from it. Um, I think for like his personal legacy, I think that in a lot of ways he's remembered, it's come up multiple times, but his stubbornness. I think that his kind of belief and principle is one that does stand out. It's hard to read any of his letters or writings and not see that he did have this very clear vision of what he believed was kind of like right and wrong. Um, and I think that there is something admirable about that. I think that he's someone who can be remembered as someone who was probably a good example of one of our presidents that really did come from nothing and then wound up becoming president of the United States. But I think his ultimate legacy is one of just kind of he didn't do the things that needed to be done to move the country on from the Civil War in a healthy way and in a way that protected the rights of all Americans. And I think that's probably the largest aspect to his legacy, and it's one that is going to kind of be a stain on it for all time.
Yeah, and I would say my view on it is, we all know, he to be fair to Johnson, he is kind of in an impossible position. First of all, he's not even elected
Mhm.
the president; he's just kind of thrown in by virtue of assassination, and so he inherits Lincoln's cabinet. He's going against a Republican Congress, but I would say his biggest problem was he was completely unwilling to even, think about compromise. Like he
Mhm.
never even, went into that door, went through that door. So I mean, that's kind of where that's kind of a good spot to leave with President Johnson. So now we move on to our next elected president. He was the hero of Appomattox, the general that won the Civil War for the Union. Let's talk about the 18th president of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant. Number 18, Ulysses S. Grant, Republican, 1869 to 1877. 46 years old, from Ohio. So, so President Grant is kind of, in some ways, he didn't necessarily really seek out the presidency, but because so many people at that time were like, "Hey, you're very popular. Yeah, I guess you could probably say, he was more popular than his predecessor, Andrew Johnson, without a doubt." And so, like, hey, I guess if people are willing to elect you president, you might as well run, right? So that's kind of how it goes. But he was born Hiram Ulysses Grant on April 27th of 1822 to Jesse Root Grant and Hannah Simpson Grant, and he is the first president to have both parents alive at the time of his inauguration. And he married Julia Dent in 1848. They had 5 children together. And what is very interesting too, also another first for him, is that he was the first president to be elected without winning the majority of the white vote. Because for the first time, African Americans in the South were given the right to vote, and about 700,000 did, which was about 12% of the popular vote. Excuse me, the total vote. So he's obviously not surprising. He's very, very popular among Black Americans because, of course, he was in large part the reason that they were able to fully gain their independence. And, of course, Lincoln deserves a ton of credit for that, too. But talk about Grant's sort of popularity, I guess, among Black Americans and, how that ultimately was able to win him the presidency in 1868.
Grant kind of followed in this American tradition we have of electing war heroes president. So you can even go all the way back to George Washington. And there's other examples. The most notable one before him probably is Andrew Jackson. And we continue that here with Ulysses S. Grant. He is, the popular hero of the Civil War. He, like, kind of even the moniker of U.S. Grant, like United
Mm.
States, was even something that people like kind of rallied behind. Like he was just this popular symbol during the war. And then for this kind of Reconstruction era, he goes on like this nationwide tour and kind of becomes a celebrity. And like especially with like the freed African Americans in the South, they kind of latch onto him as this figure of being like a liberator for them and this just kind of popular hero. And as kind of there's all this clamoring around him and this popularity, and kind of the idea starts getting floated that he's going to run for president, it becomes pretty clear that like he can win this pretty easily just because people love him. Um, it doesn't really like, not that it doesn't matter what he believed, but like to some extent, so long as it was within like the normal reigns for politicians at the time, he kind of could have spouted whatever. People still would have elected him. People just liked him. He was kind of just that popular figure, and I think in a way that I'll kind of compare to like Zachary Taylor when we talked about him.
Mhm.
Grant doesn't entirely know what he's doing. Um, like he's not a politician. He doesn't have like this huge like vision and like specific policies for everything, but he does have kind of these like he does kind of have this sense of right and wrong that kind of helps guide him. Um, and he has a very controversial presidency from a historical standpoint because there's a lot of debate about kind of how it should be viewed, and obviously we'll get into that.
100%. That's I mean, he is without a question. He's at the top of my list in a different way, but in for different reasons, of course, but in the same way, sort of an Andrew Jackson is. You look at any list ranking presidents, and of course we'll have our list at the end, but you look at any list ranking presidents, you're not real sure where President Grant is going to be, and
Hmm.
so and there's a lot of reasons for that we'll get into. But as far as his personality, despite his successes, he was a very, very shy man. As a matter of fact, during the Civil War, he would he would bathe in a closed tent so that nobody would see him in the nude. So he would also smoke 20 cigars a day, and he'd love to ride on horseback. And as a matter of fact, as president, he got a speeding ticket and had to pay a $20 fine. So his presidency started off fine. He certainly had a very popular campaign slogan, "Let us have peace,"
Hmm.
and that became sort of the moniker. But unfortunately, the hatred of the Civil War had not died at Appomattox in 1865 because you've got a big, big problem. You've got those in the North who want to punish the South. You got those in the South who want to punish blacks. So
Hmm.
it's a very, this sort of begins the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. And they're really the sort of, I guess you could say, the terrorist wing of the Democratic Party. And you know, through a series of anti-Klan laws, Grant pretty much gets rid of them fairly quickly. So talk about that sort of the rise of the Klan, and Grant's like, no, we are not going to have this, and pretty much shuts them down.
So basically, we were seeing what could be called terrorist activity from the Klan, specifically in the South. Basically, there were multiple, they were called the Klansman riots, which typically happens during election years, where basically there would be this big fervor and the Klan would kind of organize and would try to stop Republicans and free black men from voting in elections to kind of elect all white Democratic governments in these southern states that could then pass what we would now call Jim Crow laws. Um, and then that would kind of cement it so they wouldn't need to go kind of rally to stop the vote. It would be kind of enshrined in law that these people wouldn't be able to go and vote for these candidates that supported specifically civil rights. So we're seeing this, and this isn't some like peaceful thing where they're just going and like, no, we're not going to let you in. It's extremely violent. They're murdering people. You're seeing we're seeing like a rise in lynching, and this is kind of where we see that start to really come about. And it's like there's a reason why they're called the Klansman riots, and there's like they were just extremely violent, terrible events that were happening in these southern states that because of Reconstruction were already kind of chaotic. Um, Grant takes these rights very seriously, though, and with that support of the Republican-led Congress, they pass multiple bills against the Klan, and basically he authorizes that the Union troops that are occupying the South, because of Reconstruction, are basically allowed to intercede to stop them. Is one of the big things that he does. There are a couple different things with it, but that's probably the most major one, and that kind of puts an end to that kind of era. Now we do see like later Klan intimidation, like going into the future of American history that we'll probably talk about in some later episodes. But for this period and this kind of like extreme violent uprising, this is kind of the last time we see that. Grant puts an end to it in this era, and we won't see it come up again until these kind of racial issues are at the forefront of our political dialogue again.
Yeah, and with Grant, I would say this is certainly one of the bigger things that he will always be popular for us.
Hmm.
He didn't necessarily back down to the Klan. He says he says no. He passed a series of anti-Klan laws, as you mentioned, and as a matter of fact, he actually appointed African Americans to prominent federal offices and instituted voting rights for them as well. So he's very much a champion of Black rights in America.
Hmm.
And so, I think his actions, his beliefs, his policies, show that. And because of this, he won re-election in 1872. But like most second terms, I guess you could say going back all the way to Thomas Jefferson, his second term was pretty chaotic and miserable. And violence again rose in the South, and state after state was recaptured by the Democrats. And in 1873, an economic depression in the North made Southerners further question, if Reconstruction was even worth it or not. And
Hmm.
so, we have that come around. And so really, I would say the low point in Grant's administration is not just the economic depression, but also the governor of Mississippi asked for federal troops to deal with the escalated violence in the state. It's completely out of control. There's violence everywhere. And so the governor of Mississippi is pleading with Grant to send federal troops, and Grant did not. And so I'd like to hear. Do you think there was any specific reasoning behind this, like why he didn't send federal troops? Do you think maybe it would escalate it? Maybe did he think that it would further elongate the violence? Like, what do you think Grant's reasoning behind not sending the troops to Mississippi was?
Sorry, let me find my notes on that real quick.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that it's very interesting that you come around to this and you're thinking, okay, does he's been such a champion for Black rights. He took out the Ku Klux Klan. He's appointed Black people to pretty prominent positions, and all of a sudden he just does nothing when the violence is just going completely out of control in the South. So I don't know. I'm just it's curious to me, but I'd also like to kind of hear your thoughts on that as well.
Um, so from what I have in my notes here, um, basically he was worried about kind of the political upheaval and the changes that were happening politically at the time, and he thought that it might kind of stunt the growth of his kind of pro-free black men policies in other areas. So you were seeing kind of a rise in what were called like the liberal Republicans, who are more of they weren't holding to the same kind of strategies that the radical Republicans were. These would be the ones that were saying, "Is Reconstruction really worth it? Like kind of what's in it for us? Like we've tried these policies and it's not working. It might just be better just to give up. Like we kind of want this era and these kind of remnants of the Civil War to go away." And while this wasn't the largest block, it was a growing block. There was kind of this growing frustration with it. So, in a way, Grant was concerned about that politically and thought that that could kind of set back his whole agenda, and that it might be better to kind of like take a step back to eventually take two steps forward. Um, which I think, like, arguably looking at it now, it's kind of fair to say that that was probably a mistake, that it didn't really work out the way he wanted to, and we'll talk about that more with Hayes.
Yeah.
Um, but no, I think I'm taking this in a little bit of a different direction. I think Grant is really interesting because I think that he recognized, especially in kind of like social issues, he recognized a lot of the like where the tides were turning, and he kind of recognized some of the justness behind them. Like he voiced not a ton, but he did voice some support for women's suffrage, and said that he believed that every citizen should have the right to vote, which was not like a common viewpoint at all at that time, especially coming from the president. He was like a pretty strong believer in the rights of freed black men. And he also voiced what is considered to be a more compassionate Native American policy
Yes.
for the time. He did believe that Native Americans should be like fully assimilated into white society, which there's some issues there. But he's someone that for the time was very progressive on all three of those fronts. And I think that that's really interesting. Um, and I think that it's just interesting reflecting on like, I'm not sure that I'm not sure that people knew all of those things. They knew that he was a strong proponent of the rights of African Americans. That's part of the reason why he was elected. But on the other two issues, those weren't kind of the forefronts of issues for the country, and those weren't things that were neither of his viewpoints were necessarily very popular. Um, and that's something that historians have talked about more, is kind of like he's someone that did, and in his writings about them, did kind of have this sense of like, this is what is just. And I think that's interesting. um, I don't think that with his Native American policy, he lacked two things that I think were interesting. He didn't understand how to bridge the gap between kind of like the white Americans and the Native Americans, and kind of bridge the cultural gap. He, like I said, believed Native Americans should just assimilate to white culture, which they didn't want to do for obvious reasons.
Right.
Um, and I From what I could find, he didn't really understand that, but he did do some things that were really big. Like he appointed a member of the Seneca tribe to be the leader of like the like Indian Affairs Bureau, which is like a huge deal to put a Native American in charge of the federal government's policy over Native Americans. That was something that like had not happened before. So like he kind of recognized some of those things, like there needed to kind of be a little bit of this dialogue, but I don't think he fully got it. And those are just interesting issues that like reading about Grant um, kind of a new emphasis people have put on aspects of his administration. Um, and I know that was a little bit of like a kind of a rabbit trail, but
No, no,
um,
that's where I was going actually. So I'm
mhm.
glad you brought it up.
And then but then another thing we were originally talking about the scandal with his administration. Um, since I talked about a good appointment he had, I'll talk about the bad. He was My take on his administration was that he was bad at appointing people. He was not good at sensing people's character, and was just kind of like, well, they said that they support what I support, so I'm just going to believe them. And he wound up getting, partially because of like the spoil system and that sort of thing, a lot of people in all sorts of or not elected, in all sorts of appointed office and federal offices that basically were just kind of in it for their own personal gain. And that resulted in a lot of issues for his administration, because when you have people that aren't all on the same page and are kind of in it for themselves, they're not going to be working for kind of the larger goals of the administration. And, that's where we have like a lot of these, there's just a lot of like little scandals that pop up um, throughout specifically his second term. They kind of put a stain on his administration of just like people just became frustrated with it, because it was like, these same things keep happening, and these same people keep making these things that are like these huge errors and are not popular. And President Grant is coming out being like trying to do damage control, but at some point people kind of lost patience with him. But like I think most historians now would agree, like he really was like unaware that these things were going on. Like this wasn't him like trying to like protect himself. Like he was kind of getting wrapped up in these things, and he was kind of put between a rock and a hard place, because he's appointing these people that kind of the party's telling him to appoint, and it's kind of the accepted people for to appoint, and then they're not doing their jobs in a proper manner, and these scandals come out, and then he's kind of like, oh no, like I don't know what to do about this, and everyone is just getting more and more like just kind of fed up with it. And I think that's a just like a summary of his second term. At least that's kind of the way I view it.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to you made the point earlier when we first started talking about Grant, how like many former war heroes who were elected president, he wasn't great in policy making, right? Like he's
Hmm.
not a politician. He doesn't have sort of a set goal. He's just kind of going along with what's happening in the country. Like whatever happens, okay, now we're going to address this. But he's not, I guess he's not looking over the vast landscape of what's happening. He's just looking at the here and now, the immediate.
Hmm.
And so, like you said, he did appoint cronies, people who probably weren't very qualified for certain positions, and that did cause a lot of problems and a number of scandals. And so, I guess the best way to sum up Grant's presidency, his 8 years in the White House, would be that socially his heart was in the right place, and socially I think we would all pretty much look at today, he was ahead of his time, right? I mean, I did
Hmm.
not know that he was a proponent of women's rights. I'm glad you brought that up. And of course we brought up how he was extremely sympathetic toward Black Americans. He wanted to give them the rights of white people, but maybe some of the policies that he promoted or created, maybe that those probably weren't the best way to address those. So, but yeah, he serves his 8 years in the White House, and again, he's got a very mixed legacy, but he leaves the White House, and he actually wrote his own memoir late in his life. As a matter of fact, a few days after he finished his memoir, he died on July the 23rd of 1885 at the age of 63. And he suffered from throat cancer, which isn't all that surprising because of the number of cigars he smoked. And his
Hmm.
final words, actually his final word, a singular, is just water,
Hmm.
which again, I guess makes sense considering he dealt with those type of health issues. So, yeah, I mean, he's got his legacy is kind of a mixed bag. It's kind of hard to wrap your arms around. Is okay, his beliefs, they're in the right place, but he also appointed some pretty darn crooked people to those
Hmm.
positions. So I guess how would you in totality look at the Ulysses S. Grant presidential administration?
I think like it is just kind of hard. Like, yeah, again, his heart was in the right place. He promoted some policies that were very beneficial to the country. And I think that kind of his stance on Reconstruction actually was a good stance for the time. Um, but he just kind of got weighed down in all the scandal, and he wasn't able to stop kind of these political shifts from happening. Like as former Confederates were able to begin to vote in the South again, those states started to go back to the Democrats, and those Jim Crow laws were being enacted, and he was a little bit helpless to deal with some of those issues, even though he spoke out against them and recognized them as problems. There wasn't really like an obvious solution that he had in front of him to kind of solve them. And as the scandals got worse in his administration, it became harder for him to be able to find people to work with politically. So I think that it's definitely an administration, and his presidency is one that can be remembered for kind of the striving to do the right thing. But I think that at the same time, you have to kind of acknowledge the weight of the scandal and the problems that that caused for his administration, and kind of the loss of public trust over the course of his 8 years in office.
It's well put. So, Grant leaves after two terms, as all of his predecessors did. He will actually emerge in very soon. But first, we got to talk about his successor, a man named Rutherford B. Hayes. And before we even get into him, let's talk about the 1876 election, which was one of the most notable in presidential history because of the fact that the Republican Party was looking for a candidate who could be Grant's, sort of Grant's opposite. They wanted a guy who had a reputation for honesty and integrity, and so they chose the governor of Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes, and he ran against Democrat Samuel Tilden, who won the popular vote, and it looked like he was going to win the election. And as a matter of fact, Hayes went to bed telling reporters he'd lost. He thought
Mm,
he thought it was over. And eventually, like the 2000 election, the recounts in many of the states were in dispute. So we got 4 months of recounts and this and that until finally a winner is decided in an 8-7 vote by a special electoral committee. And they handed the 3 disputed states and the election to Hayes. And so, in some ways, it's a little similar to, say, like the 2000 election, where there was a sort of this delay in these recounts in the states. Like, nobody's 1,000% sure, who's won the election, but eventually it does come back. It is the Republican Hayes, and so one hurdle blocked him from the White House, and that was confirmation from the House of Representatives. And while Democrats threatened to filibuster, mysteriously those kind of faded, and there kind of began these rumors, I guess, that is still persisted to this day, about the so-called Great Compromise. So
Mhm.
talk about that, and how many people were very, very suspicious about how Democrats are against Hayes, and all of a sudden it just kind of goes away.
So it's pretty widely accepted as fact that there was a deal that was reached among them, and we know, at least to some extent, there was, because of the way Hayes will act upon taking office. Um, but basically, it was starting to gear up to look like Tilden might still have it, even in the House. There was a lot of moves there, and Republicans were kind of doing these kind of efforts to try to kind of discredit the election results in some of these kind of key southern states that were a little more purple, and at least in the post-Civil War elections have been kind of leaning towards the Republicans. And they were kind of trying to play these games around it to try to kind of shore up enough electoral votes, and enough votes in the House for Hayes to win. Um, and it was having mixed success. So basically, kind of both party leaders kind of sit down and have this conversation where basically the Republicans kind of say, "What do you want for us to keep the White House?" And basically, what the Democrats say is end Reconstruction. Like,
Mm.
first thing, get in there. All the southern states, we want no Union troops occupying them anymore. We want kind of an end to these different policies of trying to kind of like not only like rebuild the South, but to establish the rights of um, African Americans there. And basically, the Republican Party kind of views it as this greater win to be able to hold the White House and hopefully get more like legislation that they view as being helpful to the country as a whole passed through, than to kind of die on the hill of Reconstruction, something that is already even losing popular support within their own party. And basically, they're like, it's a deal. The House winds up approving that Hayes is the winner of the election, which is not a popular thing at all. Hayes did not win the popular vote. It's the first time that um, you have, when there's only two major candidates, the popular vote, a majority of the vote.
We lost Isaac again. Hold on. Let's see. So I'll wait for him to come back in. I think his technology might have uh, malfunctioned again. But yeah, I mean, he makes a good point about Hayes. This is not He's not popular at all coming to the White House. I mean, this is not the way you want to come into the executive mansion, of course, what it was called at the time. So I mean, he's and we'll see where this manifests itself, very, very soon, as far as what may or may not have been, exchanged during the Great Compromise. Isaac, are you back in here with me?
Yes, I am. I
All
don't
right,
know
go ahead.
what's up with my Wi-Fi today. I'm sorry about that.
No, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. So Hayes comes in the White House. And by the way, real quick, some personal information. He was born on
Mhm.
October the 4th of 1822 to Rutherford Hayes Jr. and to Sophia Burchard. And he married Lucy Webb in 1852. They had 8 children together. And he was the first president actually to install a telephone in the White House. And this is what I thought was kind of funny. His wife Lucy banned liquor from the White House, and for this very reason, she was called Lemonade Lucy.
Mhm.
And she kind of she banned liquor, and her husband wasn't exactly huge on that, but he went along with his wife, and I think there was an old saying at the time that water flowed like wine at state functions at the White House. So very, very interesting situation with the president and especially, the first lady. But he was very much an academic. He'd gather all the information he could, and then he'd make a decision, and he would, do his best to not move on that position. So as far as a personality wise, as a decision maker, talk about Hayes and how, he was, I guess, somewhat unique to some of the presidents of his particular era.
Yeah, I think like compared to like Grant and Johnson, I think that like he's someone who is much more open to compromise, and he's very much someone who's going to sit down, like you said, kind of take all the um, kind of facts of the matter and the different opinions and kind of think it through and try to find what he thinks the best answer is. He was a lawyer, he was a staunch abolitionist before taking office. He has a little bit more kind of experience in politics as someone who was a member of the House of Representatives and a governor. So he has kind of some more kind of legislative experience, kind of understanding how the office works. Um, and he, I think, uses that to his advantage. I think just for kind of like his role as commander in chief and just kind of running government, like I think it's kind of hard to fault him there. Like he did a pretty good job. I don't think that it's like outstanding, but I think just kind of like running the day to day, kind of getting things done, kind of hearing the different sides and trying to kind of mediate matters. I feel like he did a pretty decent job at that. He wasn't someone who I think was known for having like a really like striking character flaw as some of the other presidents of this era do. Like he wasn't particularly stubborn, like Johnson. Um, he I think, and this may be mean to Hayes, but I think kind of the thing that I always take from him is that he's kind of boring. Like he's not his era as president, his presidency is not particularly very exciting outside of kind of the drama about whether he will actually win the election or not. But even after that, it's just kind of an era where, I wouldn't describe as a particularly exciting man. And I feel like his presidency, while there were a couple notable events, particularly like the end of Reconstruction is the most important, obviously, but he's not someone that I feel like is a really distinct like person that stands out in your mind. Like he's not a distinct figure. Um, and I think that like personally, it's hard to tell if that's just because of his personality. I think part of it plays into the fact that we were dealing with a weakened executive at this time, so he had a little bit more limited power, um, which may have affected kind of that kind of collective memory for why he may not be as remembered much in like kind of like the greater like American consciousness. But that's, and again, I might be throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but he's just kind of boring to me. My
Yep.
honest opinion.
No, I feel you there. So before we get into his presidency, let's give a proper introduction to President Hayes.
Yes.
Number 19, Rutherford B. Hayes, Republican, 1877 to 1881, 54 years old, from Ohio. So President Hayes is, like you said, a very, I guess, a boring character. Part of me really wants to like Hayes. I mean, I do. He's an optimistic guy. We can't, forget to mention that, like most of the presidents of this era, he's got an outstanding beard. And I just have to say this, for the people watching or listening, I would strongly advise you to Google a picture of Rutherford B. Hayes in his 20s, because for my sports fans out there, he looks identical to a future Hall of Fame quarterback, Drew Brees. I mean, looks just like him. It's crazy. Like people out there, you got to Google it. Looks just like him. So there's some background information on Hayes. So we basically I bring up his optimism. He had almost an unrealistic optimism about Reconstruction, and how at least ending it would work. And so once the well-off white man came into power, he thought that maybe this could sort of that they'd have sympathy toward Black Americans, and the South was still in the process of Reconstruction. And federal troops were still stationed in the state houses of Louisiana and South Carolina to protect black people who supported a Republican-based government from the Democrats, who are mostly ex-Confederates. And so he proceeded to make, without a doubt, the most controversial move of his presidency, and that is to remove those troops
Mhm.
from Louisiana and from South Carolina. And like you mentioned earlier, a lot of people think that this was a byproduct of the quote unquote Great Compromise. And so, Hayes kind of represented a side for the Republican Party that did want to end Reconstruction. So, is there still debate as to whether, okay, this is Hayes' decision because this is his viewpoint, because he comes from this particular, I guess, wing of the Republican Party, or is there still this vast? The only reason he did this is because it was from the Great Compromise of 1876.
Most historians would say this is just because of the Great Compromise.
Okay.
Um, he, during his campaign, had spoken out in favor of Reconstruction, which is probably part of the reason why the election was so close. Um, and he did make a switch kind of right after the election as things were starting to unfold, but it's kind of unclear, like the timetable for the Great Compromise and some of the accusations around that, kind of when all that unfolds. Um, his support for the civil rights of Black Americans doesn't change, but kind of without Reconstruction, it's kind of impossible.
Yeah, and like I brought up earlier, he thought that the sort of, I guess, rich, well-to-do white man would see the error of their ways of
Mhm.
owning slaves, excuse me, and
And
see
like,
that. No, go
oh,
ahead.
sorry. He was like a lifelong abolitionist too.
Yeah,
So, taking it from his viewpoint too, this is something that kind of in his mind is obvious. Like, that these rights should be shared and that they need to be protected is kind of obvious to him, and it kind of has been his whole life. And still, I think maybe a downside to his optimism is that he thinks that if it's just presented in the right way, all the people that were holding these racist viewpoints would just kind of be like, oh no, it all makes sense now. We need to protect these rights. And that just wasn't going to happen. And it didn't happen.
and it shocked Hayes.
Mm,
And so this happens. The troops leave the South, which gives the ex-Confederates full control of all the governments in these southern states. And this is, of course, absolutely positively disastrous because it pretty much guarantees Jim Crow laws
mm,
and segregation, violence, and justice for Black people for another century. And so this, I think, no question, is the biggest stain on Rutherford B. Hayes's legacy. Is you know how do you promote, and again, obviously a lot of it had to do with the Great Compromises, as many people believe, but how do you promote Reconstruction? How do you promote being able to give them these rights and then just kind of turn your back on them? And so that's it's a terrible point in our history, because
mm,
it pretty much kind of sets us back another step, or it certainly sets Black people back another step. And so that happens. And so the attention now turns to what is going to become important for not just Hayes, but actually the next two presidents, and that is civil service reform.
mm,
And so this is a very, very interesting situation, because the civil service was basically government jobs. It's postal officials, tax collectors, and at this point, there's no income tax, and most U.S. Imports and exports came out of the port of New York, and thus the collector of the port of New York was a very it was an extremely important position in the federal bureaucracy. Excuse me. And the New York Custom House was run by a faction of the Republican Party, which will become very, very important for these next few years, and that is the Stalwarts,
mm,
who were led by Roscoe Conkling, New York senator, and their appointments to the Custom House were questionable at best. They often appointed very corrupt individuals, and he was an enemy of Hayes. So Hayes, who's not somebody who has like much of a backbone, he kind of steps in and he removes the chief collector of the Port of New York, a man named Chester A. Arthur. And so just discuss that sort of situation with Conkling and Hayes. And, Hayes kind of shows a little bit of decisiveness, shows a little bit of backbone in this decision.
Mhm. I feel like this one is like a little bit of a double-edged sword for Hayes because he's doing what's definitely the right thing, which is like civil service reform needs to be done. It's not right just to kind of appoint cronies to all these different positions. These people need to have some like qualifications. Um, and he kind of basically sets out to do that because that's something that he has that executive authority to do. He can appoint whoever he wants, he can fire whoever he wants to these different positions. So he starts doing that and getting rid of Arthur at the time, and will continue to be, and we'll talk about more when we get to him at the end of this episode, kind of this symbol of the spoil system and even
Yeah.
of corruption. But he's kind of a face of it to a lot of people, and part of that is because Hayes firing him and it kind of blowing up a little bit because it was controversial. People were not happy, especially New York politicians, because this is kind of a system that they've set up. A lot of these politicians have gotten their rise and their start in politics through being appointed to some of these lower level positions because of the spoils system. So this is something that's kind of personal to them because this to them is just the way that you move up through politics, and this is the way everybody does it. And who is Hayes to come in here and try to change that? Um, but the thing that hurts him a little bit with this is that because of that, this is what a lot of people cite as kind of resulting in his difficulty in actually getting any legislation passed to change the spoil system. Is that basically kind of upon this kind of broad sweep and kind of trying to clear out these positions and appoint people who he views as being qualified, it results in a lot of these politicians, um, a lot of the stalwarts for basically saying like, okay, no, we're not going to compromise on this, kind of hardening their viewpoints. So I think it's a little bit of a double-edged sword because I think, like, undeniably, he's doing the right thing. But at the same time, it did come with a little bit more of a greater political cost. That again is one of those things that I don't think. I'm not sure that he fully realized that would happen, and I don't want to act like he's like dumb because Hayes wasn't dumb, but it was like he just I think at times he kind of got caught up in what he believed, and even though he wanted to reach compromise on things, not everybody else did. And I don't think that he always realized that as he was doing things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a fair point. And it's like I said, the stalwarts are going to become very, 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 very important over the
Mhm,
next few years for a multitude of reasons. And so, Hayes makes, as you mentioned, the controversial move to remove Arthur, and bring in his own guy. And so, really the final year of Hayes' presidency is fairly quiet, except for, I guess, the most notable thing that happened is that he became the first president to travel to the West Coast.
mhm,
And he hoped that was a move that he hoped would bring some unity to the country. And many called for him to run again, despite sort of the up and down, complicated 4 years that he was in office. But he stuck to a campaign promise, and he did not run for re-election in 1880. And, I would say, yes, a lot of it had to do with the fact that it was a campaign promise to run one term, but he
mhm.
didn't really enjoy the presidency that much. Like he didn't
No.
have, as most people do, if not all, a very good time in the White House. And so, you know, while I guess most presidents are, because they want to think they did a good job. Hayes was very optimistic. He was proud of his accomplishments, and as a matter of fact, I even read that he said that he was the best president since John Quincy Adams, with the exception of Lincoln. Okay, so I guess that's his viewpoint. And so he and his wife Lucy go back to their home in Ohio, and Hayes spent the remaining years of his life working towards education reform and civil rights for
Mhm,
Black Americans. So I will say this to Hayes' credit: he didn't just completely abandon, fighting for
mhm,
civil rights, as it had appeared, at least at the end of Reconstruction. And so, he keeps going, and he kind of set a standard of public service for ex-presidents. So I think he deserves
mhm,
credit in that regard. And he passed away on January the 17th of 1893 at the age of 70. And his final words were, "I know I'm going where Lucy is." Of course, Lucy was his wife. So with Hayes, it's kind of, again, I think it's a mixed bag on his legacy. He's often ranked kind of a mediocre president by most lists. So I don't know. As far as a person, as far as someone who did fight for civil rights, he deserves credit.
Mhm.
It's just, again, policy wise, where do you think he kind of ranks in that regard as far as how he's looked upon historically?
Yeah, I think again, I think he's a little bit of a hard person to place because he was doing, trying to do the right things. It just didn't really unfold the way that he wanted it to. And sometimes that was because of political miscalculations. Sometimes that was just because like things just didn't swing that way, and there wasn't really much you could do about it. And I think that's why he's a little bit hard to place because for the most part, like he is kind of considered to be like holding kind of these views that were like important for moving the country forward. Um, but it just didn't kind of play out on the scale that he had kind of hoped it would. And it didn't play out on a scale that really was super impactful for the time. So I think that's kind of like why he's remembered kind of that just mediocre because it's not that the things he's believing and advocating for are bad. Like they're arguably good things, but it's more of that it just didn't play out. It just didn't kind of unfold the way that kind of anyone was really hoping it would. Um, so, and he's one of those presidents that there's debate. Like, say, um, with the whole election, things didn't work out that way, and Tilden became president. There's kind of the debate: do things look that different at the end of 4 years of Tilden as it does with 4 years of Hayes? And the question is, would Tilden have had the same amount of gridlock? Because Hayes just wasn't able to get things done legislatively, and I think that it plays into the larger issue of the day, which is just that we have a weakened executive. So most of the things he was able to do, and the things that we talked about him doing, were basically all through kind of executive appointments and that executive office, and not through Congress. And that was because that's kind of where all his power was. So we see some movement there, but it's nothing that it's not on a large scale.
Yeah, nothing significant. And
Hmm.
yeah, I mean that's kind of where we lead the Hayes presidency. He's kind of, I mean, maybe not in the same way as like a say like a Millard Fillmore or somebody, but
Yeah.
I mean, again, he's one of those people. You say Rutherford B. Hayes, most people may not necessarily know who you're talking about, and some of that was like you make a good point that yes, the the executive branch rather was very much weakened, at least in contrast to Congress. And so now we come around to the 1880 election, and you thought you'd seen the last of Ulysses S. Grant, but that was not the case. The country had sort of forgiven him for his for some of the corruptions of his administration, and he had just over the past 4 years during Hayes' presidency, he'd kind of taken a worldwide tour. He met with foreign diplomats, and so people thought, hey, Grant may win a third term. And so he kind of regained a lot of the popularity he lost. But when it was all said and done, it was another general from the state of Ohio, from the Civil War, who won inauguration. That was James A. Garfield. Number 20, James A. Garfield, Republican, 1881, 49 years old, from Ohio. All right, so President Garfield, James A. Garfield, was born on November the 19th of 1831 to Abram Garfield and Eliza Ballou, and or Ballow rather. He married Lucretia Rudolph in 1858, and they had 7 children together. And so he was the first former college professor and the first preacher. And I
Hmm.
think he's the only preacher to become president. And he was very outgoing, and like some of his predecessors, he was very obsessed with the ins and outs of policymaking. And I think I actually read this years ago, and correct me if I'm wrong, Isaac. He could write simultaneously with both hands. Am I correct in that?
Yes, he could.
There you go. Very talented guy. And so, sometimes he maybe skip some sessions in the House of Representatives to watch some professional baseball in Washington. He at times appeared to be kind of indecisive. And, he didn't necessarily take strong position on certain issues, and he didn't really want to offend anybody. So I guess talk about Garfield's personality, why he was elected, and how he was, I guess, viewed by the common public once he did become president in 1881.
So I will note that I am biased here. Garfield is one of my favorite presidents, even though there's not a lot of time for him to be in office for me to love. There's only a little while he's there.
Yeah.
Um, but he's someone, I've read a lot of different descriptions of him. Kind of publicly, and especially after his death, he was viewed as being kind of like this stoic, kind of like really respectable figure. But in more contemporary reports from his life, kind of describe him as being like this ball of energy and someone that constantly wanted to be doing something and constantly wanted to be engaged in something. And he was described as being pretty extroverted. And that those are kind of the more contemporary reports that I've been able to find and read about. But he was someone who liked to think about things very logically. He was also an amateur mathematician, um, and I actually believe I'd have to double check this that some of his proofs are actually used and taught today.
Hmm. I did
Um,
not know that.
but he was someone who like thought about policy in a very logical way and believed a lot of things and wanted to see a lot of kind of major reforms done, but also kind of had like this kind of insight to the strategy behind it and was good at kind of thinking like this is how we get this done and how we work with these people, and these are areas that we can compromise in. And I think that he kind of had that energy behind him, uh, where I think, and this is my personal opinion, we obviously don't know. I think that if he was able to serve his full term, he would have been able to get at least a couple things done that he had been striving to do. He has just in his like kind of his big issues. He does believe in civil rights for freed African Americans. He moderates that view a little bit, but it's more out of trying to find compromise and ways to try to kind of get that done in a way that is like realistic for the political culture of the time. Um, he is one of his major issues is civil service reform. He wants to kind of tackle the issue of the gold standard and try to like resolve kind of some of the monetary crisis that's been kind of carrying on for a while. And a brief, I'll make this my brief summary of his presidency then. You know, but none of that really happens because he doesn't live long enough for it to
Right.
happen. Um, but my personal bias, I enjoy his energy and I enjoy his kind of um, like nuanced plans to kind of get all these reforms done and passed through Congress with popular support. And obviously, who knows what would have happened, but I'm on the side that I think he could have pulled it off. Um, but I just enjoy him as a figure, and I kind of enjoy what I feel like he represented, which was kind of this like, energetic reformist, and it obviously didn't play out.
Unfortunately, did not, and of course, by the references you've made, it did end up being the second shortest presidency to William Henry Harrison. I don't think, and certainly I hope nobody will break that record. But
Mhm.
you have where he comes in, and his first job as president is to address political appointments. And again, as we talked about with the stalwarts, more times than not, this was a very corrupt system, and it's one that Garfield decided to kind of challenge head on. Against Roscoe Conkling, the senator from New York, as we mentioned, who did run the stalwarts, that faction of the Republican Party. And kind of the issue was, once again, like in Rutherford B. Hayes' administration, was the chief collector of
Mhm.
the Port of New York. And he decided to appoint a rival of Conkling's to the position of chief collector. And this led to a firestorm of opposition. But to his credit, the president held pretty strong to his beliefs, which to that point wasn't or was a little surprising. Like, I mean, sometimes he
Mhm.
did appear to be somewhat indecisive. And in protest, Conkling resigned from the U.S. Senate. And this was sort of the symbolic beginning of the end of the spoils system. And, you know, unfortunately, Garfield did not live to see the fruits of this victory. But before we kind of get into the everything that follows after that, talk about how he took a stand against the most, by far the most popular, or not popular, but the most powerful, rather, political faction of that day.
So he, with his campaign, because like I said, he was a strong advocate against the spoil system. Um, to try to balance his ticket, his vice president was Chester A. Arthur. He didn't personally pick Arthur; he was picked by the party. But from most reports we have, they got along pretty well. Like there wasn't like some like super close relationship there or anything, but they were like they didn't have anything bad to say about each other. Um, he but basically came in and he used Arthur being his vice president as a little bit of a tool to where when he was going after the spoil system, he could kind of be like, Arthur is not saying anything because Arthur kind of knew his place. So he has kind of this like symbol of the spoil system as his vice president, which in some ways he didn't like. And we have some writings where he talks about how he kind of feels like that could get in his way at some point. Um, but he kind of takes this strategy that I think is interesting, where he kind of like goes and kind of attacks kind of the head of the serpent first, and is like, I'm going to go after like the most prominent person here, and like I would say like getting like him resigning from the Senate in protest, like that's a win. Like he's basically lost an opponent from Congress. It's probably going to be easier for him to pass legislation against the spoil system now, um, and he's coming out of it kind of looking pretty good for the most part, because even though he's had this big clash with like what is an important senator and an important party figure, he's able to do it and to kind of play it off like he's like, oh, like I don't know, like I don't really know what I'm doing, and the senator has this massive reaction to it, and it kind of makes him look like he's overreacting. Um, and again, and there is the debate there. I'm on the side because I am biased towards him that it was kind of like a stroke of genius, but there are other people that will argue that he really was just kind of going with the flow and didn't have like this calculated plan with it, which is equally as possible. Um, but you see, yeah, he's making these moves in a way that is similar to Hayes, but he's better at kind of communicating with his allies in Congress, and kind of shoring up support there to be able to try to get things done. And he also kind of recognizes some of the issues with the weekend executive of the day, and kind of he stays close to his congressional allies, which is something that like it's not that Hayes didn't do it; it's just Hayes didn't emphasize it as much as Garfield did. Um, so I think that is maybe one thing that kind of sets him apart policy wise, and making those kind of executive decisions to kind of try to move policy, which is similar to what Hayes did, but I think is different, just because he was able to kind of shore up a little bit more political support.
Again, like you, I am very much well, maybe not as much of a fan as you are, but certainly I'm with you in that as far as the five presidents we, or at least are going to talk about, or going to finish talking about in today's episode. I think he had the most potential to be the best president of the
Hmm.
five. The only problem is that, of course, did not happen
Hmm.
because it kind of what all began. The early days of his presidency is when all the spiraling events happen afterwards. Uh, as we discussed earlier, I think with James K. Polk a couple episodes ago, the White House was a very open place to the public, right? Like, I mean, pretty
Hmm.
much anybody could walk in. It was, after all, I mean, still is, but even way more so in 1851, the People's House. And, it was open to the public, and Garfield was kind of overwhelmed with office seekers who met with he and his administration. And one of these office seekers was a gentleman named Charles Guiteau, who spent the following year kind of hanging around the Republican Party, and especially the Republican National Convention in 1880, and believing he could sort of contribute to a winning party ticket and thus get a job. He aligned himself with Roscoe Conkling's stalwarts, and thought that he should get the job of consul in Paris, despite the fact that he couldn't speak French nor any foreign language. So I think you see where this is going. Oh, we just lost Isaac. Whoa. Okay. Let's see. I'd love to have him in there for this very interesting part of of the story of President Garfield, the very brief one. Let's see. I don't know what's going on. Maybe his Wi-Fi is getting out again. Hopefully, we can get him back in here soon. So again, I'll try and tell the story best I can. So Guiteau is he's hoping to get this job. Now, of course, Garfield wins office. And so this fellow is thinking, hey, I contributed to this guy winning the election. And he's one of these office seekers. He still felt he was owed the job. And after making his way to the waiting area in the White House, he was dismissed by the Secretary of State, James G. Blaine, because his nomination would need confirmation in the Senate. And so, he basically Garfield's nominee had caused a deadlock in the Senate. But after the nominee was confirmed, Guiteau came back, and he approached Blaine again, who told him, "No, you're not getting this position." And I believe Isaac is back in the room. Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. I had to switch to my phone. We're going to hope that I really don't know what's up with my internet today, but we'll hope that it cooperates better than my computer is.
Listen, your computer chose a bad time to kick out of this, because this is certainly the most interesting part of the story. So,
Yes.
Like I talked about, he's denied the first time by Blaine, because Blaine, trying to, I guess, to be somewhat polite, he's saying, listen, there's a deadlock in the Senate. Well, once the deadlock in the Senate ends, here comes Mr. Guiteau back to the White House, and James G. Blaine just says, no, you're not getting the job. You're not qualified. You're not getting the job. And Guiteau was very, very angry about this. And, he now believed that the only way to make his point known, because he believed that, matter of fact, I read he even felt like he had a divine calling by God to do what he was going to do, was to kill the president. And no, go ahead.
So he would actually say that he wasn't told necessarily that he had to kill Garfield. He was told that Chester A. Arthur had to become president. So how do you get Chester A. Arthur to become president when he's vice president? Well, there's only one way there. And, adding into this, notably, there's two things that, and this is some speculation, but most historians will make this, of two things that could have probably happened after that in his kind of mind, which was obviously warped. But one is that Chester A. Arthur could pardon him. Two, Chester A. Arthur is a proponent of the spoils system. So in his mind, you kind of see this kind of link in the kind of links in the chain of how he's kind of getting what he wants by doing this. But obviously, he was a sick individual. He was not.
Well,
yeah.
No, not at all. And I do want to give a big shout out to an author who I've read much about, James Garfield. Candace Millard has written some excellent pieces on the president, and certainly on this issue. I read from her book that Guiteau had actually, he just basically started stalking Garfield. And he'd go with him to church, and Garfield would even write about how he heard a young man behind him who would yell in church if he disagreed with what the pastor was saying. And so at one point in June, he had a clear shot at the president. And but because he was with his wife, Lucretia, who had just recovered from a pretty serious illness, he, I guess, had some sympathy for the president and for his wife. And he actually, as a matter of fact, bought a gun that he thought would look good in a museum. So again, he's nuts. So eventually, July 2nd, 1881, he stalks Garfield to the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station, Washington, and shot him twice. The first bullet rested in the president's arm, the second in his torso. And as the police held Guiteau away, he yelled, quote, "I did it. I will go to jail for it. I'm a stalwart, and Arthur will be president." Now, this did not immediately kill Garfield. This wasn't like Lincoln, where he died 9 hours later. This did not. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, there are also some reports from some of the people that were there that as he fired his gun, he even yelled, "This is for Vice President Arthur." So that's something that, when we move on to Arthur, kind of plays into the start of his administration was a rough one. But continue.
Yeah. So he's held away. He's arrested. Well, and again, we'll I guess touch on what happens after that. But Garfield sort of lingered for a while, and changes in his condition, good or bad, was reported all around the country. And some days it looked like he would improve and pull through. But the reality is, and I think you would agree with me, Isaac, if this happens in 2022, Garfield survives.
Oh yes, 100%.
Because because keep in mind, Garfield was still a fairly young individual. Like, I mean, he was
Hmm.
49, 50 years old. He wasn't, an older guy. The medical care could not have been worse.
Hmm.
You had they didn't believe in germs, and they were
Hmm.
sticking instruments and fingers up his back trying to locate the bullet. But what were you gonna say?
Well, I was going to say, exactly what you said. American doctors did not believe the germ theory yet. That was not a common belief at the time. It was becoming like a larger force in medical communities in Europe, but that had not translated across the ocean. Um, and like they were taking very detailed notes of their care for him because they're taking care of the president. And the one good thing about that is, from like a historical standpoint, people can look back and say, like, look at how bad they messed this up. Like there are a lot of uh, like medical experts that have said, like looking back on it, that if they had just left the bullet there and kind of treated to make sure the wound didn't become infected, that he probably would have healed up and have been fine. And that they didn't even need to perform surgery to try to remove the bullet. But they continued over and over and over again to try to remove the bullet, and they didn't believe in the germ theory. And we have in the notes times where it talks about them dropping, their instruments and picking them up and going right back to trying to perform surgery on him. So you have what causes, definitely causes infection and a lot of other issues for him medically. And, it's not that the doctors weren't well intentioned. They thought they were doing what was best for their patient, and they were trying to give him the best care that they knew how to give. The problem is that their understanding was so limited that they didn't really realize how they were killing him.
They were, and that's the real tragedy of it. And as a matter of fact, Alexander Graham Bell was called
Hmm.
to try and locate the bullet, but he used, I think he used a metal detector to try and find it, and he thought he sort of found the area, but it just didn't really work out. So,
Hmm.
in August, Garfield wrote a letter to his mother, and assuring her, telling her not to worry, and that only time and patience would bring him through. And so, sort of throughout the time that Garfield was ill, he lost about 80 pounds.
Hmm.
So he appeared much more feeble than he had before he was shot. And after months of suffering, moving back and forth from the White House to a beach in New Jersey, Garfield, while being watched by General David Swaim, awoke complaining of severe pain in his chest and begging for the general to help the pain stop. And when Swaim put his hand on the president's chest, Garfield clutched his heart and exclaimed, quote, "Oh, Swaim, can't you stop this? Oh, Swaim." And when the doctors came in at General Swaim's calling, they found the president unconscious, and he was pronounced dead on September the 19th of 1881 at the age of 49. And so basically, after, I guess it was nearly 70 days or so after
Hmm.
after the shooting, President Garfield dies. And days later, Arthur is sworn in as the 21st president of the United States. And in case you're wondering about the psychopath that did all this, Charles Guiteau was hung a year later, or was hanged a year later after a trial. So Garfield's legacy, the tragedy of it is really, in some ways, like William Henry Harrison. The biggest thing that people kind of study is his death. I mean, that's kind of the part of it. But he does deserve a ton of credit for sort of taking a huge stand against the spoil system. And again, I think he deserves a lot of credit for that. But what say you sort of about his very brief presidency and what happened in it?
Mm. It's one that had a lot of potential, and I just, again, as a fan, I wish we could have seen it unfolded, because I really do have a belief that I think that he could have been potentially one of the great American presidents, and it just didn't happen. I think that it's a reminder of kind of the importance of thinking through our actions and trying to do things in a way that is not only just but also strategic. And I think that kind of maybe a lasting legacy that he didn't intend to give is make sure you pick a good vice president.
Yeah, you're not kidding. And I think many presidents who pass in office, could say that. So
Mhm.
we now come to the final president of this episode, Chester A. Arthur. So without further ado, let's give him let's introduce the 21st president. Number 21, Chester A. Arthur, Republican, 1881 to 1885, 51 years old, from New York. So Chester A. Arthur, he was born on October 5th of 1829 to William Arthur and Malvina Stone. He married Ellen Herndon in 1859. They had 3 children together. She passed away in 1880 during the election campaign. So Arthur is a very interesting character. He's from Vermont, but he was in very, very many ways, he was very much a New Yorker, right? He always ate at the best restaurants, dressed in the latest fashions. And he liked to go shopping, or on shopping sprees, rather. He was an avid fisherman and often went on trips with his boss, Roscoe Conkling. So talk about his sort of interesting personality that is, I don't know if we've ever seen one quite like him assume the presidency.
Mhm. I wouldn't describe him as a particularly confident person. Um, there's not he was a little bit, I'm not even sure if uppity is the right word. He thought highly of himself, but he was not confident at the same time, which is kind of a weird comparison. And then, I think just kind of for him, like largely is like at the time, the way he was viewed, I think, like he was quite literally a symbol of corruption. Like that's how people viewed him. He was the symbol of the spoil system. He was a symbol of kind of like all the problems with the spoil system. But yet, because he'd been fired by Hayes, he was also this kind of popular, like, kind of like hero to the stalwarts. So you had like this weird kind of mix of like hatred for him, but also this kind of like respect for like what he symbolized politically. And I feel like in that way he is just kind of an odd figure, and there's not a lot of other figures that I really feel like encapsulate this weird balance of like kind of like sympathetic, like you want to feel bad for him sometimes, but then you like look more deeply at him and you're like, no, like I don't want to feel bad for him. And I feel like for me personally, that's kind of where I fall on Garfield, or sorry, not Garfield, on
Arthur.
Arthur, is that he's someone that at times I want to feel sympathetic for, and then there are other times where I'm just like, I don't like you. And I feel like as we talk about his presidency, I feel like the viewers will kind of see that weird balance.
Is a very weird balance because he is a complex individual, to say the very
Hmm.
least. So, and again, we talk about management styles, and again, like most vice presidents who come in upon the death of their predecessor, he was Garfield's opposite. Garfield was very meticulous, studied the tiniest of details, whereas Arthur was a very, very relaxed, sort of blasé
Hmm.
sort of management style. Not one that promoted hard work. Let's put it that way.
Hmm.
It was said at the time that Arthur would walk into his office at 10 o'clock, sign some papers, go for a walk at about 4 in the afternoon, take a nap, and then, meeting with family for dinner, and, repeat the process day in and day out. And a matter of fact, a former White House staffer would later say that Arthur didn't do today what he could put off until tomorrow.
Hmm.
So again, not exactly an ambitious president. Let's put it that way.
Hmm.
So he comes in the White House off Garfield's assassination, and for him it was somewhat of a social demotion, right? He was
Hmm.
like we talked about. He lived a very rich life, and the White House. To be fair to Arthur, the White House wasn't in the greatest shape in the world, and he basically said, I'm not going to live here unless you guys renovate the place. And it was renovated. And a matter of fact, one of those contributors was a young Louis Comfort Tiffany, who helped renovate the White House. And basically, also for the first time in years, it became a more of an active social scene because, of course, Garfield didn't have much time at all to establish much of one. And Hayes, of course, he and his wife didn't have much of one at all. So in order to sort of convince a skeptical country, because that's the word I've definitely described, because people were not exactly fond of this guy, to convince the country that he was no longer part of the New York corrupt political system, Arthur officially broke ties with his dear friend Roscoe Conkling and the Stalwarts. And as president, he kind of fought against the spoil system in some ways, I guess, in reaction to what had happened to Garfield. Which honestly, himself being a beneficiary of the spoil system was one of the great ironies, in my opinion, in presidential history. So in 1883, he signs the Pendleton Act, which was the first major piece of legislation for civil service reform. So talk about the Pendleton Act and also just in general how he flips and does a 180 like a lot of presidents have done with some of their personal views in fighting the spoil system and in some ways sort of the corrupt parts of politics at this time.
Before I get to just that, I want to talk about kind of, you touched on it, but the public perception of him coming into office. Okay. So, our Garfield is shot and is, lingering for this pretty long period of time for there to kind of be like not a functioning president. Arthur does not step up during this time, and probably rightfully so. He basically hides out. Like, he is not attending social functions. He is keeping a low profile. He is not going and like holding cabinet meetings. Like, he is staying out of the fray because any move that he makes would be seen as a view of kind of usurping Garfield's authority. And he knows that that is not going to be popular. He also knows that, like, already he's not the most popular figure anyway, so like that's not going to help him. And then you do have added on that, even though people knew that like Arthur had orchestrated Garfield's assassination, Garfield's assassin did yell
his name.
Yeah, his name, and was publicly showing support for Arthur. So he has kind of this like really just terrible combo of like there's not really a right thing he can do while Garfield is alive. So once Garfield dies, he kind of has to try to do like some damage control for his character. And that has mixed results. And you talk about the White House becoming a social scene because of what's commonly referred to as the Tiffany glass restoration. And, that actually did help him a lot. It created this, it kind of remade it into the people's house, and one that kind of had this elegance to it and this kind of high society feel to it, but was still accessible to people of kind of all different classes. And that was something that, arguably wasn't even like completely intentional. Like some aspects of it were, but that did help heal his image a little bit. But he wasn't someone like there's even kind of contemporary writings where people, and even he's saying like no one is really rooting for me. Like people are kind of like he's here, but there's no one that's like an avid like I'm a Chester A. Arthur fan. So as he goes in, he basically starts looking for like, what am I going to do now? Because he wasn't someone that was expected to ever become president. He was put on the ticket solely to balance out with Garfield's kind of more radical views. So he's on there and he picks up the issue of this.
Uh-oh. I think we may have lost Isaac again. No, go ahead.
Reform
it. We lost you.
That's something that's not at all expected. And some of it is arguably like in a way trying to preserve the memory of Garfield and trying to kind of pick up that popular cause for him. And then also it's kind of this way to like kind of push this new image of himself. And he like arguably it works. Now it's not enough to make him like this new popular figure. There's people that he angers and are basically like, you're kind of a traitor to your own side because you were the proponent of the spoil system. You are like the golden child of the spoil system. Um, but I think that it's kind of like a little bit of a redeeming kind of like character arc for Garfield, or not Garfield, sorry, for
Arthur.
Arthur, is that he kind of recognizes when when he's the one that's up to bat, he kind of recognizes that, like, these things do need to change, and there are reforms that are necessary.
Yes, well put. And I think for Arthur, another major contribution he made was to the Navy. And the Navy was not in a good spot at this time. If you look at, we had about three ships that could stand up to the modern navies of the world, and so the president adds numerous ships with rifle guns, and he's basically in a spot where he says, okay, we're going to upgrade the Navy. We're going to make sure that our that our this part of our military is going to be well equipped to fight wars. And to his credit, this update to the Navy really helps us in the Spanish American War. And so I think, to Arthur's credit, I think you could say maybe this, at least long term, this might have been the biggest accomplishment of his presidency, was the Navy.
No, I think that, like, that's a totally fair point. I think that, like, he's someone that I don't feel like any of his accomplishments, except for the spoil system, were things that were really like massive, like popular goals, and are like really stand out, like, and again, kind of that collective like American memory, in the same way like kind of Hayes struggled with that. But like, his are ones that were more lasting accomplishments and affected us kind of going forward in ways that the other presidents of this era didn't really have that same long lasting effect to American policy. So Arthur definitely has some of that, and like some policy that really like kind of transcends his administration. But it's nothing that's like, while it's important, it's not things that are like popular fronts, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And he was actually, well, I'll get to that in just a second. But yeah, again, not a ton happens while he's president, outside of those two,
Mm.
his contributions in honoring, I guess, Garfield's legacy to fighting the spoil system, and his contributions to the Navy. So by the time 1884 rolls around, similar to Andrew Johnson, he was not renominated for the Republican ticket. And, mostly given the fact he had a quiet presidency, and he had risen to the office through
Mm.
the assassination of his predecessor. So he left office quietly, but his retirement was relatively short, because on November the 18th of 1886, Chester A. Arthur passed away at the age of 57 years old due to a kidney ailment that he had been battling all throughout his time in the White House. His final words are unknown. So, his he was actually, I think even Mark Twain may have wrote about it at the time.
Mm.
He was actually pretty well remembered at the time of his death, but by the time we get to present day, again, he's kind of in somewhat the same breath as Hayes, looked at as kind of a mediocre president, right?
Mhm. I think that, like, again, I said it earlier, but that kind of redemptive character arc, I think, kind of like is something that's appealing about him. But like, and this is probably the only other notable piece of legislation really during his presidency, though, bring up just briefly, like, he also gave into political pressures when there was a lot on him. He wasn't very resolute most of the time. So like, he signed the Chinese Exclusion Act, and while he originally took a stand against it, when they continued to put pressure on him, he signed a revised version of it that was not as bad as the original one. Um, and it's one of those things where I think the reason why his memory has kind of faded is because I feel like like his personality, who he was not something that kind of stood out kind of in the American, like broadly to everyday Americans, in the same way that a lot of other kind of great presidents have been remembered. They're remembered not just for the things that they've done in office and their major accomplishments, but also for the way that kind of they made the American people feel, and kind of um, their ability to kind of become like have a little bit of like a mythos around them. And Arthur was just not somebody who was going to have that. And I think that kind of like downplayed his legacy some. Um, I think nowadays, like, the way that he's kind of primarily viewed is just as like the spoil system was good. He wasn't like the greatest guy in the world. The Chinese Exclusion Act was really bad. And they kind of just look at it as this presidency that's a little bit of a mixed bag, and this guy that's kind of a mixed bag. And even though there were like some great accomplishments, there were also some drawbacks, and it just wasn't of, um, well, I'd say it was a more consequential than Hayes' administration was. I think it's one that's still just not. There's just nothing in it that's there that's going to stick out to the American public for years to come, and I think that's why he's kind of been um, forgotten.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to put it. So, okay, so we come to the end of this episode, episode 4. We covered 5 presidents, and
Hmm.
man, a lot happened. We
Yes.
had one president got impeached. We had a presidential assassination, and kind of in between, and then after Garfield, sort of some mediocre presidents. Again, not well remembered. Grant's more remembered for his service in the Civil War, really, than he is for his presidency. So, I remember you said in the last episode, towards the end, you said like, coming in. You said coming in the episode 3 that the that sort of the theme of the episode was America is going to make its decision on if it's going to be a country that continues to promote slavery or gets rid of it. And at the end, you going into this episode, you said, okay, America's made its decision. Now, how do we address it? And
Hmm.
so we come, of course, through Reconstruction, ending in during Hayes' administration. So, what's kind of your final takeaways from this episode, and how do you think they will relate to episode 5 coming up?
Hmm. What I would say is like they're trying to address it. Like we see, I think every president we've actually covered today proposes some kind of a civil rights bill, and it just either gets watered down and is passed with basically nothing in it, or it just doesn't happen due to kind of partisan debate. And so I think that you're kind of seeing now in this era, in this kind of Reconstruction and early post-Reconstruction era in America, that doesn't know how to address this issue and isn't quite sure what it's going to do yet. And sadly, like, it's going to take for these tensions to kind of bubble up to the surface again for it to really be addressed. um, so I think we're at this point where they've made their decision. They're kind of that we have that literal reconstruction aspect of kind of rebuilding the country, not just physically but also politically, and they kind of have all these issues on the table in front of them. And even though I would say that the civil rights issue is probably the largest one, they just can't agree on it. So you kind of have a little bit of this political strategy as we've gotten kind of later, past especially Grant's administration, of just kind of ignoring it and hoping that it just kind of resolves itself. And even though it's not like openly said and there are attempts to do things, that's just kind of the feel of the day. And not much really gets done on that issue. It doesn't mean that none of the presidents try to do anything. Because again, all of them in this era have tried to do something. It just isn't. Things just aren't lining up, and it's not working out, and people aren't willing to make the needed compromises, or the compromises to get something passed are so great that it doesn't. The final bill wouldn't even mean anything. So I feel like for that, now that we have moved to this era where it's kind of what do we do now? I think that question didn't go away. I think they were kind of like, we don't know. Like, I think that was kind of their answer. Um, and that is part of the reason why I think this era is kind of forgettable, is because they don't have an answer and they don't figure one out, and they don't address like the biggest issue on the table. But they, at least if that's like, that sounds terrible, but like for the policy things and the issues in the country, if that's like the main course of the feast, they take out a bunch of the side dishes, but they never actually touch the main course. So it's this weird era to be in. And again, we won't see the resolution to that big issue until all the way till really the 1940s, 50s, and 60s is when we really see that kind of bubble back up to the surface. And in the meantime, since then, in the episodes uh, the episodes we're going to be going into, we're going to see that they kind of get distracted from that issue because other things start happening. Um, and it just takes a while for it to be finally addressed once and for all. And that's kind of, I think that's probably like the biggest like flaw of these presidents is that they weren't able to get anything done on that. But you see just little, they're not able to take steps forward, but they're at least trying to like shuffle forward a little bit. So I give them partial credit for trying, but it doesn't work out.
Yeah, and you know, the unfortunate thing is, yes, you know, we could still have, you know, admiration for them trying, but ultimately, you know, when we look at some of our greatest presidents trying, you know, as cut and dry and harsh as it may sound,
Mm-hmm.
trying unfortunately just doesn't cut it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's I guess that's the best way to end the episode. So I'm looking forward to episode 5, going into a very interesting part of, because we sort of shift from a slavery period to now a more economic period as far as what's going on at this time, and you know, the gap between the rich and poor and things of that nature. We'll get into that. We'll get into some fascinating figures in the presidency. So Isaac, once again, I appreciate you coming on the show, man.
Thank you again for having me. I've really enjoyed the series so far, and I look forward to the next episode.
Absolutely, man. Appreciate it. All right, so that is all the time we have for today's episode. So yeah, we covered a lot today. We covered the first impeachment. We covered the second assassination. We covered, you know, 2 of these presidents were not even elected to the office. And then, you know, you got, of course, Hayes and Grant kind of in between there, who, you know, as we talked about, they made their efforts, but, you know, ultimately that they're more, I guess, forgotten in American history. So with that said, I hope everybody has a great rest of your day, and I look forward to everybody looking out for episode 5, because it is going to be, I would say, much more interesting than episode 4. So have a great day, everybody. Stay safe out there. God bless you all. Peace out.